Sophia had always been drawn to the nursing profession for its human connection, but nothing in her decade-long career had prepared her for this assignment. The message she received was brief but urgent, requesting her services for a private, high-paying job. The details were sparse. She was to care for a 10-year-old boy named Arthur, who had been in a vegetative state since a mysterious accident. The family's wealth and influence were well known in the town, but they kept their lives shrouded in secrecy. The sprawling mansion, perched on the edge of a dense forest, loomed before her as Sophia's car wound up the gravel path. The large iron gates had opened automatically upon her arrival, a silent invitation that felt more like a command. She parked and stared at the imposing structure, its towering walls casting long shadows in the fading light of day. A knot formed in her stomach, a sensation she couldn't quite shake. When she rang the doorbell, a tall woman with sharp features opened the door. "You must be Sophia," she said, her voice as cold as the air inside the mansion. "I'm Anna, Arthur's mother. You'll have full responsibility for his care. My husband and I are often away. We don't like disturbances." Anna's eyes, a cold and distant gray, barely met Sophia's as she spoke. She led Sophia through a series of dimly lit corridors, the air growing heavier with each step. The mansion, though elegant, was devoid of warmth. Paintings of somber-faced ancestors lined the walls, their gazes following her as they passed. Finally, they arrived at Arthur's room. The sight before her took Sophia's breath away, not because of the luxury, but because of the sadness that enveloped the space. Arthur lay in a massive bed, surrounded by high-tech medical equipment. His small, pale face was motionless, his chest rising and falling with the help of a ventilator, a delicate boy, trapped in a motionless body. Sophia approached the bed slowly, her heart heavy with compassion. She could see that despite the wealth and technology, Arthur was still a child abandoned to a quiet existence, lost in whatever darkness had claimed his consciousness. "Make sure he's comfortable," Anna said, her tone clipped. Without another word, she turned and left the room, leaving Sophia alone with the boy. The door clicked shut, and Sophia found herself standing in the oppressive silence. As she began her routine, checking the machines, adjusting his position, Sophia thought she saw, out of the corner of her eye, a flicker of movement. She froze, her eyes darting back to Arthur. His hand lay still, and she shook her head, dismissing the thought as a trick of the light or perhaps her own exhaustion. But something inside her stirred, a feeling she couldn't quite explain. This wasn't going to be an ordinary job. Over the next few days, Sophia settled into a routine, though the mansion's eerie quiet and the strange absence of Arthur's parents never stopped gnawing at her. She would check on Arthur several times a day, ensuring his vitals were stable, adjusting his position, and maintaining the equipment that surrounded his small, fragile frame. Despite the advanced technology, it felt like the house was frozen in time, stuck in an unspoken limbo, just like the boy she was caring for. Arthur's room, though furnished with every comfort, felt like a prison. Thick velvet curtains blocked out most of the daylight, casting the space in a perpetual twilight. Sophia often found herself drawn to the window, where the sprawling garden outside seemed to grow wild and untamed, as though neglected for years. It was a strange contrast to the strict order of the interior, and it made her feel uneasy, as if something was being kept out, or perhaps, something was being kept in. Arthur's parents were rarely home. When they were, they hardly spoke to Sophia, and they never once visited their son's room while she was present. Their behavior disturbed her. How could they be so distant, so detached from their only child? Their coldness was palpable, and Sophia found herself wondering what kind of people could abandon their son to such a fate without a second thought. It was during one of those long, quiet afternoons when Sophia first noticed it. A slight flicker of movement. She had been reading by Arthur's bedside, a habit she had formed to fill the silence. When something caught her eye, Arthur's fingers had twitched. Ever so slightly, she blinked, staring at his hand. It lay still again, as it always had. Her heart quickened. She rose from her chair and stood beside him, watching closely, but the movement didn't repeat. Was it just her imagination? She had heard stories about the occasional involuntary muscle spasms in patients like Arthur, but this felt different. There had been intent in that movement. It was almost as if Sophia shook her head, trying to dispel the creeping thoughts that threatened to overwhelm her. Arthur was in a vegetative state. The doctors had been clear. He wasn't aware, wasn't responsive, but as the hours passed, she found it harder and harder to ignore the feeling that something was off. That night, she lay in bed, staring up at the ceiling, the stillness of the house pressing down on her. Arthur's name echoed in her thoughts, and with it, the image of his small hand twitching ever so slightly. The next morning, Sophia resolved to pay closer attention. She had seen something, of that she was sure. As she went about her day, she began talking to Arthur, hoping for some response, however faint. She spoke to him about mundane things. The weather, the garden, the book she was reading. At first, it felt strange, as if she were speaking into the void, but then, just as she was adjusting the blankets around him, it happened again. Arthur's fingers twitched. This time, Sophia didn't look away. Her breath caught in her throat as she watched the small, almost imperceptible movement of his hand. It was brief, but unmistakable. "Arthur," she whispered, leaning closer. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. His hand remained still, his face as expressionless as ever. But the feeling of unease grew inside her, stronger than before. That evening, as Sophia paced the length of her room, her mind raced with questions. Was Arthur somehow aware of her presence? Could he hear her? And if so, why hadn't his parents noticed this? Or had they, and chosen to ignore it? A chill ran down her spine as the thought crossed her mind. What were they hiding? Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong in the mansion. The more time she spent in Arthur's presence, the more convinced she became that the boy was not as unresponsive as everyone believed. She had kept her observations to herself, unsure of how to bring it up to Anna and Henrique. They had made it clear from the beginning that they wanted no interference, and the coldness in their interactions didn't exactly invite trust. One rainy evening, while the house was eerily silent and the windows rattled from the wind, Sophia decided to test her theory. Sitting beside Arthur's bed, she leaned in closer than usual, speaking in a low, gentle voice. "Arthur, if you can hear me, try to move your hand again," she whispered, her heart pounding in her chest. She waited, every second stretching into eternity as she stared at his still hand, and then, it moved, just a small twitch, but it was enough. Sophia gasped, her eyes widening. It was not her imagination. Arthur was trying to communicate. He was in there, trapped inside his own body, but he was aware. Sophia's hands trembled as she reached for his hand, gently holding it between her own. "Arthur, I'm here. I'll help you, I promise." But what could she do? And more importantly, why hadn't his parents noticed these signs? Sophia had been a nurse long enough to know that family members were often the first to detect any changes in a loved one's condition, no matter how small. Yet Anna and Henrique remained detached, distant, as if they were content to leave Arthur in this state forever. The more Sophia thought about it, the more she realized how strange everything was. The mansion, despite its grandeur, felt more like a mausoleum. Arthur's room, with its heavy curtains and constant hum of machines, was more like a crypt than a place of healing. And his parents, they were too indifferent, too distant, as if they were hiding something. Late one night, after the household had gone quiet, Sophia couldn't resist her curiosity any longer. There was something in Arthur's medical records that didn't add up. She had access to basic information about his condition, but the details were vague. The boy had suffered a mysterious accident, but no one had ever explained what had happened. The doctor's reports were sterile and cold, with no indication of hope or a plan for his future care. Sophia knew there was more to the story. Slipping into Arthur's room, she noticed for the first time that his medical equipment was connected to a computer in the corner. It wasn't unusual for advanced monitoring systems to be linked to digital records, but this one looked different. It wasn't just tracking his vitals. It seemed to be running some kind of program, something she couldn't quite understand at a glance. She approached the computer, her pulse quickening. Could there be more information hidden in the system? Something that might explain the strange occurrences she had been witnessing? Sophia hesitated, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. She knew she was crossing a line, but her instincts screamed that there was more to this situation than met the eye. The screen flickered to life, displaying a password prompt. Sophia frowned. She tried a few obvious guesses. Arthur's birth date, the family's last name, but none of them worked. Frustrated, she stared at the screen, her mind racing. There had to be a way to access this data. Just as she was about to give up, she heard a sound from the hallway. Footsteps. Her heart leapt into her throat as she quickly shut off the computer and turned to Arthur's bed, pretending to adjust his blankets just as the door creaked open. Anna stood in the doorway, her sharp eyes narrowing as she took in the scene. "What are you doing?" Anna asked, her voice tight, almost accusatory. "I was just making sure Arthur was comfortable," Sophia replied, forcing calm into her voice. She couldn't let Anna see the panic that had gripped her moments before. Anna's gaze lingered on the computer for a second too long, and Sophia felt a chill run down her spine. Anna knew she had seen something, and now, Sophia was certain she was being watched more closely than ever. "Be careful with him," Anna said, her voice low, almost as if it carried a hidden meaning. "He's very fragile." With that, Anna turned and left the room, the door closing softly behind her. But Sophia couldn't shake the feeling that the warning had been about more than just Arthur's physical condition. Something darker, something far more sinister, was at play in this house. After the unsettling encounter with Anna, Sophia knew she couldn't continue to ignore her suspicions. Something was being kept from her, something dark and dangerous, and now, with Anna's cryptic warning lingering in her mind, she was more determined than ever to find out the truth about Arthur's condition. But Sophia also knew she had to be careful. Anna and Henrique were watching her, and any wrong move could jeopardize not only her job but perhaps even her safety. The following day, Sophia went about her duties with deliberate calm, trying to act as if nothing had changed, but her mind was racing, plotting her next move. She needed access to that computer again, but this time, she had to be more prepared. If the information she sought was there, it could hold the key to understanding what had really happened to Arthur. That night, after Anna and Henrique had left for one of their frequent late-night outings, Sophia made her move. The house was quiet, save for the soft hum of the machines in Arthur's room. Sophia had brought a small USB drive with her, hoping to download any files she could find. She approached the computer with a steady resolve and, after a few deep breaths, she began trying passwords again, this time, after several failed attempts. She guessed correctly. Arthur 123, the screen flickered, and she was in. Sophia's heart raced as she scrolled through the files. At first, they appeared to be standard medical records, but as she dug deeper, she began to notice something strange. These weren't just medical reports, they were experimental data logs, documenting procedures and treatments that had never been approved by any medical authority. Her stomach turned as she read the descriptions. They detailed attempts to stimulate Arthur's brain activity using untested drugs and experimental devices. The treatments were erratic, their timing strange, and they seemed to have no clear goal other than to keep Arthur's body alive at all costs. It was as if someone had been using him as a test subject, pushing the limits of science with little regard for the boy's well-being. Sophia's hands shook as she copied the files onto her USB drive. She had to get this information out of the house, but the more she read, the more questions flooded her mind. Why were Anna and Henrique doing this to their son? And more disturbingly, how long had they been doing it? The records didn't tell the whole story. There were gaps, as if some of the data had been deliberately erased. Important details were missing. Critical moments in Arthur's treatment had been wiped clean from the logs. Sophia felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't just an ordinary case of negligence or desperation. Someone was hiding something. As she backed away from the computer, her thoughts raced. She needed to leave, now, but just as she turned to exit the room, she heard a soft creak from outside the door. Someone was approaching. Panic surged through her. Sophia quickly shut off the computer and slipped the USB drive into her pocket, trying to appear as normal as possible. The door handle turned slowly, and her heart pounded in her chest. Henrique entered the room, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the scene. "Still up?" he asked, his voice calm but with a dangerous undertone. "It's late." Sophia forced a smile, hoping her fear didn't show. "I just wanted to check on Arthur one last time before bed," she replied, her voice steady. Henrique stepped further into the room, his eyes lingering on her for a moment before drifting to the computer. Sophia's heart skipped a beat. He knew, somehow, he knew she had been digging where she wasn't supposed to. "Good," Henrique said, his tone flat. "Arthur's condition is delicate. We trust you're being careful." There was a pause, heavy and tense, as if a silent warning had passed between them. Sophia nodded, barely breathing, as Henrique turned and left the room without another word. As soon as the door closed behind him, Sophia let out a shaky breath. She had been too close to getting caught, but now, more than ever, she knew she couldn't stay in the house much longer. The files she had copied were dangerous, and if Anna or Henrique found out what she knew, they wouldn't let her leave so easily. But there was one thing Sophia couldn't ignore. Despite the danger, despite her growing fear, she couldn't abandon Arthur. She had to figure out a way to get him out of this house, before it was too late. The following days were a blur of anxiety and preparation. Sophia knew her time in the mansion was running out, but she had to be careful. She could feel the tension in the air every time she crossed paths with Anna or Henrique. They were watching her closely, their polite indifference now laced with a thinly veiled suspicion. Sophia kept her head down, going through the motions of her duties while silently plotting her next move. Her main priority was Arthur. Now that she knew the extent of the dangerous experiments he had been subjected to, Sophia couldn't leave without him, but getting him out would be no small feat. The boy was hooked up to numerous machines, and even with her medical expertise, disconnecting him without causing harm would take careful planning. Late one night, after everyone in the house had gone to bed, Sophia slipped into Arthur's room. She approached his bed, her heart heavy with the weight of what she was about to attempt. The mansion was silent, the only sound the soft, rhythmic beeping of Arthur's monitors. His face was pale and still, but Sophia had seen the signs. He was in there, trapped beneath layers of medical machinery and whatever dark secrets his parents were hiding. She gently touched his hand, whispering softly, "Arthur, I'm going to get you out of here, I promise." Her voice trembled with both fear and determination. Sophia knew that once she made her move, there would be no turning back. She had already copied the files from the computer, but now, she needed to act quickly. There was no guarantee she wouldn't be caught, and if she was, she didn't want to think about what Anna and Henrique might do. Sophia spent the next hour preparing Arthur for the escape. She examined each machine, noting which ones were critical and which could be disconnected without immediate harm. As she worked, her mind raced. There was so much that could go wrong, but she couldn't let that stop her. Arthur's life depended on her. Suddenly, a sound from outside the room made her freeze. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps approaching the door. Her heart pounded in her chest as she quickly turned off the machines she had been working on, trying to make everything look normal. The door swung open, and there stood Anna, her face pale and furious. "What do you think you're doing?" Anna's voice was ice cold. Her eyes narrowed as she stepped into the room. "You were going to take him, weren't you?" Sophia's mouth went dry. She stood frozen, caught in the act. There was no point in denying it. Anna had seen enough to know what she was planning. But Sophia wasn't ready to give up. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to stand her ground. "Arthur isn't safe here," Sophia said, her voice trembling but resolute. "I know what you've been doing to him. Those treatments, they're illegal. You're risking his life." Anna's expression didn't change, but something dark flickered in her eyes. "You don't understand anything," she hissed, stepping closer. "Arthur's condition is far more complicated than you can imagine. We're doing what's necessary to save him." Sophia's pulse raced as Anna's cold words sank in. There was no reasoning with her. Whatever Anna and Henrique had been doing, they truly believed they were justified, or perhaps they had simply gone too far to turn back now. Either way, Sophia knew she couldn't stay in the mansion any longer. She had to get Arthur out, or at the very least, get the evidence into the right hands. Summoning all her courage, Sophia took a step back, her eyes darting toward the door. "I won't let you hurt him any longer," she said, her voice steady. Anna's lips curled into a thin smile, a sinister edge to her expression. "You have no idea what you're dealing with, Sophia," she said softly. "If you interfere, you'll regret it." The words sent a chill down Sophia's spine, but she didn't let her fear show. She had made her decision. With a burst of adrenaline, she twisted away from Anna's grasp and darted toward the door. Anna shouted after her, but Sophia didn't stop. She raced down the long hallway, her footsteps echoing in the eerie silence of the mansion. Her heart pounded in her chest as she made for the back exit, the USB drive clenched tightly in her hand. She needed to get to the authorities, to anyone who could help expose what was happening in this house. But as she reached the back door, she realized with horror that she wasn't alone. Standing in the shadows, waiting for her, was Henrique. "You didn't really think it would be that easy, did you?" Henrique asked, his voice dangerously low. His calm demeanor only made the threat in his words more terrifying. Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had been so focused on escaping Anna that she hadn't considered Henrique might be guarding the exit. Her mind raced, searching for a way out, but Henrique's imposing figure blocked her path. She took a slow step backward, knowing that running would be futile, but she couldn't let them stop her. "You should have left well enough alone," Henrique said, taking a step forward. "Now, we're going to have to deal with this another way." Sophia's pulse raced, her mind frantic as she tried to think of a way out. She still had the files, the proof of their experiments, but if she couldn't escape, none of it would matter. Sophia's heart raced as she faced Henrique, his calm but menacing demeanor sending a wave of dread through her. Every instinct in her body screamed at her to run, but she knew she was trapped. Behind her, the vast mansion loomed, a place that now felt more like a prison. Ahead, Henrique stood like a sentinel, his eyes cold and unyielding. Her mind scrambled for a plan. She couldn't overpower him, and there was no one else nearby to help her. Sophia's only advantage was the element of surprise. If she could somehow slip past him, maybe she could reach the woods and disappear into the darkness. "You don't have to do this," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I'll leave, I won't say anything, just let me go, and you'll never hear from me again." Henrique's lips curled into a chilling smile. "It's too late for that, Sophia, you know too much, and I can't let you ruin everything we've worked for." Sophia's pulse quickened, his words confirmed what she had feared all along. Anna and Henrique were in this together, fully aware of the horrors they had inflicted on their own son. She could only imagine what they were capable of, and what they might do to her if they caught her. Without another word, Sophia made her move. She bolted to the side, aiming for the dense woods that surrounded the mansion. The night was cold, and the wind whipped at her face as she plunged into the trees, her feet pounding against the forest floor. Branches scratched at her arms and face, but she didn't care. She just had to keep running. Behind her, she heard Henrique crashing through the underbrush, his footsteps heavy and relentless. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps as she pushed herself harder, her legs burning with the effort. She had no idea where she was going, but she knew she had to put as much distance between herself and the mansion as possible. The woods were thick and disorienting, the tall trees casting long, eerie shadows in the moonlight. Sophia could barely see a few feet ahead of her, but she didn't slow down. She glanced over her shoulder, catching a glimpse of Henrique's flashlight slicing through the darkness. He was getting closer. Desperation surged through her. She couldn't let him catch her. Clutching the USB drive tightly in her hand, Sophia veered off the path, hoping to lose him in the underbrush. The branches tore at her skin, and her breath came in short, painful bursts, but she kept going. The files she had stolen were her only chance of exposing the truth, and she wasn't going to let Henrique take that away from her. Suddenly, her foot caught on a thick root, and she stumbled, barely managing to stay on her feet. The fall had cost her precious seconds, and she could hear Henrique gaining ground. His flashlight beam flickered closer, casting ominous shapes on the trees around her. "Stop running, Sophia," Henrique's voice echoed through the woods, cold and furious. "You won't make it out of here." But Sophia didn't stop. She couldn't. Her fear drove her forward, even as her body screamed for rest. She had to keep moving, had to escape. The night air burned in her lungs, and every step felt like a battle, but she refused to give in to the exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm her. Then, just as her strength began to fade, she saw something up ahead, a faint light flickering between the trees. Hope flared in her chest. A house? A cabin? She didn't know, but it was her only chance. With every ounce of energy she had left, Sophia sprinted toward the light, her heart pounding with both fear and determination. As she drew closer, the shape of a small cabin came into view. It was tucked deep in the woods, its windows glowing faintly in the night. Sophia raced to the door, pounding on it with her fist, her voice trembling with desperation. "Help, please, someone help me," she cried, her breath coming in frantic gasps. For a moment, there was no response. Then, the door creaked open, and an elderly man appeared in the doorway. His eyes widened in surprise as he took in the sight of Sophia. Breathless, disheveled, and terrified. "What's going on?" the man asked, his voice gruff but concerned. "There's no time to explain," Sophia gasped, glancing over her shoulder. She could still hear Henrique crashing through the woods, his flashlight bobbing in the distance. "Please, let me in, he's coming." The man hesitated for a moment, his weathered face etched with confusion, but then he nodded, stepping aside to allow her in. Sophia rushed inside just as the beam of Henrique's flashlight appeared at the edge of the clearing. She quickly shut the door behind her, her heart hammering in her chest. For the first time since the chase began, Sophia felt a small measure of safety, but as the old man peered out the window, his face darkening, she knew it wouldn't last long. "He's still out there," the man said quietly. "Who is he? Why is he after you?" Sophia pressed her back against the door, still trying to catch her breath. "It's a long story," she whispered, "but I have proof. They've been doing something terrible to their son, and if he catches me, I don't think I'll make it out of here alive." Inside the small cabin, the air was thick with tension. Sophia's pulse raced as she pressed her ear to the door, listening for any sound outside. The elderly man who had let her in was still peering out the window, his weathered face grim with concern. He had seen the beam of Henrique's flashlight sweep past the cabin just moments before, but now, there was only silence. Sophia's mind raced. She had the files, the proof of the illegal experiments that Anna and Henrique had been conducting on Arthur, but if she didn't get them to the authorities, none of it would matter. The world needed to know what was happening in that mansion, and more importantly, Arthur needed to be saved. But Henrique was still out there, she could feel it. The old man turned to her, his expression serious. "You're not safe here. If he's looking for you, he'll find this place eventually." Sophia nodded, her hands still trembling. "I know, I just need to catch my breath, then I'll go. I can't stay here." The man shook his head. "You're in no condition to be running through these woods at night. There's a back exit through the kitchen," he said, pointing to a small, narrow hallway. "I'll distract him if he comes this way. You can slip out and head for the main road. There's a police station a few miles from here." Sophia's heart swelled with gratitude, though she couldn't shake the fear that even the man's best efforts might not be enough. Henrique was relentless, and she knew he wouldn't give up easily. Still, it was her only option. She had to keep moving, no matter how exhausted she was. As the man moved toward the front door, Sophia grabbed the USB drive from her pocket, Gripping it tightly, she made her way toward the back of the cabin, her eyes darting to the small windows along the hallway. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, and every gust of wind made her jump. The sound of Henrique's voice shattered the silence outside. "I know you're in there, Sophia." Her blood ran cold. He was close, too close. The old man glanced at Sophia, then nodded in silent agreement. He turned back to the front door, his body tense. "Stay quiet and move fast," he whispered. "I'll hold him off as long as I can." Sophia's heart pounded in her ears as she crept through the back door, slipping into the cold night air. The forest stretched out before her, dark and foreboding, but she had no choice. She had to keep running. She had to get to the police before it was too late. As soon as she stepped outside, Sophia crouched low, keeping to the shadows as she moved away from the cabin. The branches creaked in the wind, and every rustle in the underbrush made her nerves stand on edge. She glanced back toward the cabin, seeing the faint glow of the lights inside and the silhouette of the old man standing at the front door. She heard Henrique's voice again, this time closer, demanding to be let inside. Sophia's heart twisted with fear for the old man, but there was no time to hesitate. If Henrique found her, all hope would be lost. Without another look, she darted toward the thick woods, her feet barely making a sound as she slipped between the trees. She moved quickly, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to remain quiet. The woods were darker here, the thick canopy overhead blocking out what little moonlight remained. Sophia pushed forward, her only guide the faint hope that the road wasn't too far away. She knew she had to be careful, but every second felt like an eternity. She could feel the weight of the USB drive in her pocket, a constant reminder of what was at stake. Suddenly, a noise behind her made her stop in her tracks, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and getting closer. Sophia's pulse quickened. Henrique had found her trail. Her muscles screamed in protest as she began to run again, this time faster, more desperate. The trees whipped past her, the branches clawing at her skin as she pushed herself harder. She couldn't let him catch her, not now. The footsteps grew louder, and she could hear Henrique's voice calling after her, "Sophia, you can't run forever." Fear gripped her, but she forced herself to focus. She was close, she could feel it, just a little farther, and she would reach the road. The police station wasn't far from there. She had to keep moving. Then, through the trees, Sophia saw it. The faint outline of a road, illuminated by the distant glow of streetlights. Relief flooded through her. She was almost there, but as she stepped out onto the road, a new sound filled her ears, the roar of an engine. Her heart stopped. A car was speeding toward her, its headlights blinding in the darkness. For a brief moment, Sophia thought it might be a chance at salvation, but then she realized it was Henrique's car. Panic surged through her. She stepped back into the shadows, hoping he hadn't seen her, but the car screeched to a halt just feet away, and the door flew open. Henrique emerged, his face twisted with anger. "I told you, Sophia, you can't escape." Sophia's breath caught in her throat. She had nowhere to run. The road stretched out in both directions, empty and silent. She was trapped, desperate. Sophia stepped into the road, waving her arms frantically as the headlights of another car approached from the opposite direction. This was her last chance. The car slowed, and Sophia's heart leapt with hope. But as it pulled up beside her, the driver's window rolled down, and a voice called out. Not the police, not a rescuer, but a man Sophia didn't recognize. "What's going on here?" the man asked, his eyes darting between Sophia and Henrique. Sophia took a deep breath, forcing herself to speak. "Please, help me, he's trying to." But before she could finish, Henrique stepped forward, his voice calm but icy. "There's been a misunderstanding. This woman is trespassing on our property." Sophia's heart sank. She could see the driver's uncertainty, the way his eyes flickered with doubt. If he believed Henrique, it was over. For a terrifying moment, Sophia thought her last hope had vanished. The driver's uncertain expression as he looked between her and Henrique sent a chill down her spine. She could see the conflict in his eyes, unsure of who to believe. Sophia's breath quickened as she desperately searched for the right words to convince him. "Please," she begged, stepping closer to the car, her voice shaking with urgency. "He's lying. You have to believe me. My life is in danger. He's been keeping me locked in that house. I have proof." She clutched the USB drive in her pocket, holding it up as if it could somehow convey the gravity of her situation. The driver's eyes widened slightly, the tension in the air thickening as he glanced toward Henrique, who remained eerily calm, though a trace of impatience flickered across his face. "Listen," Henrique said smoothly, his tone one of practiced authority. "This woman has clearly been through a lot, but she's confused. I can assure you, I'm just trying to get her the help she needs." Sophia's stomach twisted. The more Henrique spoke, the more convincing he sounded. His calm demeanor contrasted sharply with her desperation, and she could see the driver wavering, unsure of who to trust. But then, something in the driver's face shifted. His eyes moved back to Sophia, lingering on the fear etched across her face. He hesitated for a moment longer before finally nodding, as if reaching a decision. "Get in," he said, his voice low but firm. Relief flooded Sophia's body as she scrambled into the car, barely able to believe her luck. Henrique's calm mask slipped for the briefest moment, his eyes narrowing with fury as Sophia slammed the door shut. Without waiting for a second invitation, the driver hit the gas, and the car sped down the dark road, leaving Henrique standing in the dust. Sophia collapsed back into the seat, her entire body trembling with exhaustion and relief. She had made it. For the first time in hours, she felt a glimmer of hope, but as the car tore down the winding road, her mind remained focused on one thing: getting the USB drive to the police before Henrique and Anna could silence her for good. The driver glanced at her from the corner of his eye, his expression still laced with uncertainty. "So, what's going on here? What's this proof you were talking about?" Sophia took a deep breath, her voice shaky but determined. "They've been experimenting on their son, illegal treatments, dangerous drugs. I found everything on their computer. I have it all right here." She held up the USB drive, her hands still trembling. The driver's eyes widened in disbelief. That's insane," he muttered, shaking his head. "We need to get you to the police station, fast." Sophia nodded, grateful that he believed her. But as they rounded a bend in the road, her heart stopped. Headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Another car, speeding toward them at an alarming rate. "It's him," Sophia whispered, panic rising in her chest. "That's Henrique. He's following us." The driver's face tightened, and he pressed harder on the gas. The car lurched forward, accelerating down the dark, empty road, but the other car was gaining on them. Sophia's breath came in short, frantic bursts. "We need to lose him," she said, her voice filled with desperation. "He won't stop until he catches us." The driver nodded, swerving sharply onto a narrow side road in an attempt to shake Henrique off their trail, but the headlights stayed close, getting brighter with every second. Sophia's hands gripped the seat as fear tightened her chest. They were running out of time. The car flew through the darkness, the trees whipping past them as the road narrowed even further. Sophia's pulse pounded in her ears, her heart racing with every turn. She could feel the weight of the USB drive in her pocket, the knowledge of what it contained pushing her forward, urging her to keep fighting. Suddenly, the driver slammed on the brakes, the car screeching to a halt as they reached the end of the road, a dead end. Sophia's heart sank as she stared at the wall of trees blocking their path. There was nowhere left to go. The sound of Henrique's car grew louder behind them, his headlights casting long, menacing shadows across the road. Sophia's mind raced, searching for a way out, but there was none. They were trapped. But then, the driver glanced at Sophia, his face set with determination. "Get out of the car," he said quickly. "We can still make it on foot." Without wasting another second, Sophia threw open the car door and bolted into the woods. The driver followed close behind as they plunged into the trees, the cold night air biting at their skin. Sophia's legs burned with exhaustion, but she forced herself to keep going. The sound of Henrique's footsteps not far behind. Branches scratched at her arms and face as they weaved through the thick underbrush, the darkness swallowing them whole. Sophia's breath came in ragged gasps, but she refused to slow down. She couldn't let Henrique catch her. Not now. The sound of Henrique's voice echoed through the woods, cold and furious. "You can't run from this, Sophia." Fear surged through her, but she pushed herself harder, her only thought to keep moving. The USB drive was still clutched tightly in her hand, the files inside more important now than ever. Then, just as Sophia thought she couldn't run any farther, the distant glow of lights appeared through the trees. Her heart leapt with hope. They were nearing the edge of the woods. If they could just reach the road, they might stand a chance of finding help. But Henrique was closing in. Sophia's legs felt like they were on fire, her lungs burning with each desperate breath as she sprinted through the forest. The lights of the road were so close now, just a few hundred feet away. Every muscle in her body screamed for rest, but she couldn't stop, not when Henrique was so close behind her. She could hear his footsteps crashing through the underbrush, relentless, growing louder with every second. "We're almost there," the driver shouted beside her, his voice filled with urgency. He pushed forward, leading the way through the final stretch of trees. Sophia didn't respond, too focused on keeping her pace. The trees around them were thinning, and she could see the outline of the road more clearly now. Just a little farther, just a few more steps. Then, they broke through the tree line, stumbling onto the road, gasping for breath. Sophia looked around wildly, searching for any sign of help. The lights of a small town flickered in the distance, just a few miles away. She could make it if she could get to the town. She had to. But as she turned to run, a car screeched to a halt in front of them, its bright headlights blinding her. For a terrifying moment, Sophia thought it was Henrique again, that he had somehow gotten ahead of them, but then she saw the emblem of a police cruiser on the side of the car. Relief flooded through her like a tidal wave. They had made it. They were safe. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, their hands resting on their holsters, their expressions serious as they took in the scene. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, his voice calm but authoritative. Sophia could barely speak, her breath still coming in ragged gasps. She fumbled for the USB drive in her pocket, holding it out as she tried to explain. "Please, you have to help us. There's a man. He's been following us. He's dangerous. I have proof. It's all here." The officers exchanged a glance, their expressions hardening. They approached cautiously, clearly trying to assess the situation. "Slow down," the second officer said, taking the USB drive from Sophia's trembling hand. "Who's following you? What's this proof?" Before Sophia could answer, the sound of footsteps crashing through the woods grew louder. Henrique burst out from the tree line, his face twisted with fury as he spotted the police. "You need to arrest her," Henrique shouted, pointing at Sophia with a trembling finger. His voice was filled with rage, but there was a calculated edge to it, as if he had already crafted his version of the story. "She's trespassing. She's stolen private medical files." The officers stiffened, their hands moving toward their holsters as they turned their attention to Henrique. But Sophia could see the doubt in their eyes. Henrique's authoritative presence, his expensive clothes, and his calm demeanor were persuasive, and she could sense them hesitating, unsure of who to believe. Sophia's heart pounded in her chest as she realized how close she was to losing everything. If the police believed Henrique, if they took him at his word, everything she had fought for would be in vain. She would be dragged back to that mansion, and Arthur's suffering would continue. No one would ever know the truth. "I'm telling the truth," Sophia cried, her voice trembling but determined. She stepped closer to the officers, her eyes pleading with them to listen. "I was hired to care for their son, Arthur. He's in a vegetative state, or at least, that's what they claim, but they've been using him for illegal experiments. I found the files. It's all on that drive." The officers remained silent, their eyes shifting between Sophia and Henrique. Sophia could feel the tension building, the weight of their decision hanging in the air. Her entire future, Arthur's future, depended on what they did next. Henrique took a step forward, his voice low and threatening. "She's lying. She's been unstable since the moment she arrived. She doesn't know what she's talking about." But Sophia didn't back down. She couldn't. "Please, you have to believe me. Just look at the files. Look at what they've been doing to Arthur." The first officer, the one holding the USB drive, glanced down at it for a long moment. Then, he nodded. "We'll take a look," he said, his voice cautious. "But you're both coming with us to the station. We'll sort this out there." Sophia's breath caught in her throat, her pulse racing with a mix of fear and hope. It wasn't the resolution she had been hoping for, but it was something. The police were involved now. She still had a chance. Henrique's face darkened, his calm mask slipping for the first time. Sophia could see the fury burning in his eyes, the realization that he was losing control of the situation. But before he could protest, the second officer stepped forward, placing a firm hand on his arm. "Let's go," the officer said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Sophia felt her knees weaken with relief as they escorted her and Henrique toward the police cruiser. The driver, who had been silent until now, gave her a small nod of reassurance before stepping into the back seat with her. As the cruiser pulled away from the dark road, Sophia closed her eyes for a moment, finally allowing herself to breathe. It wasn't over yet, not by a long shot, but she had made it through the night. The truth about Arthur, about the horrors hidden behind the walls of that mansion, would finally come to light. The ride to the police station felt like an eternity. Sophia sat in the back of the cruiser, her nerves still frayed from the chase and the confrontation with Henrique. The weight of everything she had been through pressed down on her, the horrors she had witnessed, the secrets she had uncovered. But now, as the car sped toward the town, there was a faint glimmer of hope. She had made it this far, and with the USB drive in police hands, the truth was finally out of her control. Henrique sat beside her, silent but seething. She could feel the tension radiating off him, his carefully constructed composure cracking under the pressure. He had lost his control over the situation, and for the first time, Sophia felt like she had the upper hand. When they arrived at the station, the officers escorted them both inside. The harsh fluorescent lights and sterile atmosphere of the building were a sharp contrast to the darkness of the night. Sophia was led to a small, windowless room where they asked her to wait while they reviewed the files on the USB drive. The wait was agonizing. Her mind raced with fear. What if the files weren't enough? What if Anna and Henrique had covered their tracks too well? Time stretched out, each minute feeling like an hour as Sophia sat alone, staring at the blank walls. She kept replaying everything in her head, from the moment she had first arrived at the mansion to the terrifying chase through the woods, and, most of all, she thought of Arthur, the boy trapped in that house, the victim of his parents' twisted experiments. Suddenly, the door opened, and an officer entered, followed by a stern-looking man in a suit. He introduced himself as Detective Mills. His expression was serious, but there was a softness in his eyes that gave Sophia hope. "We've reviewed the files you provided," he said, sitting across from her. "There's enough here to open an investigation into Mr. and Mrs. Ribeiro, but I need you to tell me everything, from the beginning." Sophia nodded, her throat tightening with emotion. This was her chance to finally tell the truth, to make sure Arthur's suffering didn't go unnoticed. She took a deep breath and began to speak, recounting every detail of her time at the mansion. She told him about Arthur's condition, the strange behavior of his parents, the experiments she had discovered, and the moments when Arthur had shown signs of life, when he had tried to communicate with her. As she spoke, Detective Mills listened intently, occasionally jotting down notes. His expression remained neutral, but Sophia could tell that he was taking her story seriously. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed in thought. "This is disturbing, to say the least," he said. "The files you provided show that Arthur was subjected to experimental treatments that were never approved by any medical board. It's clear that his parents were conducting these experiments in secret, possibly for years." Sophia felt a wave of relief wash over her. She had done it. The truth was finally coming to light. "We've already sent a team to the mansion," Detective Mills continued. "Arthur will be taken to a hospital for a full medical evaluation. We'll make sure he gets the proper care he needs." Sophia's heart soared. Arthur was going to be safe. After everything she had been through, she had succeeded in her mission to save him, but Detective Mills wasn't finished. "There's something else you need to know," he said, his voice lowering slightly. "We found more than just medical files on that drive. There were other documents, financial records, contracts, indicating that the Ribeiros were involved in something much bigger than just illegal experiments on their son." Sophia's stomach twisted. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "It looks like they were part of a larger organization," Mills said, his tone grave. "A group funding experimental research into the human brain. The treatments Arthur was receiving were just one part of a much larger, more dangerous operation." Sophia's blood ran cold. The scope of the situation was far worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just about Arthur anymore. There were other victims, other lives at risk. The organization Henrique and Anna were part of had to be stopped. "Don't worry," Detective Mills added, seeing the fear in her eyes. "We're going to take this all the way. We'll bring in the right people, and we'll dismantle this operation, but it's going to take time." Sophia nodded, her mind reeling from the enormity of what she had uncovered. But despite the darkness that surrounded the situation, she felt a sense of closure. She had done everything she could to help Arthur, and now it was in the hands of the authorities. As the officers escorted Sophia out of the interview room, she glanced toward the far end of the hallway where Henrique was being led into a separate room. He caught her gaze for a brief moment, his face twisted in anger and defeat. Sophia felt a surge of satisfaction. He would never hurt anyone again. In the weeks that followed, the investigation into Anna and Henrique's illegal experiments sent shockwaves through the small town and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, exposing the horrifying details of the secretive organization they had been a part of. Authorities worked tirelessly to dismantle the operation, uncovering a vast network of individuals involved in unethical medical practices and human experimentation. Sophia followed the developments closely, but her mind was always on Arthur. She couldn't help but think of him lying there, so fragile and still, while the world around him unraveled. But now, finally, Arthur had a chance at something he hadn't had in years, a real future. One rainy afternoon, Sophia received a call from Detective Mills. Arthur had been transferred to a top hospital in the city, where specialists were now overseeing his care. They were hopeful, the detective said, that without the harmful treatments, Arthur might begin to recover. Sophia felt a sense of relief wash over her, but it was mixed with a lingering sadness. Despite everything, she still couldn't fully comprehend how parents could do such things to their own child. But that darkness was behind her now, and all she could focus on was the hope that Arthur would one day wake up. Several days later, Sophia decided to visit Arthur at the hospital. She had to see him, to know that he was in a safe place, far from the cruelty he had endured. The hospital was bright and modern, a stark contrast to the eerie mansion where she had first met him. When she entered Arthur's room, the soft hum of medical equipment was the only sound. But there was something different in the air, a sense of peace. Arthur lay in a bed much like the one in the mansion, but this time, there were no strange machines monitoring him, no experimental drugs coursing through his veins. The doctors had removed him from the dangerous treatments that had kept him in a vegetative state for so long. Now, it was up to his body and his mind to find their way back to life. Sophia stood by his bedside, her heart swelling with a mix of emotions. She reached down and gently touched his hand, just as she had done so many times before. His skin was warm, his pulse steady beneath her fingers, and then, something incredible happened. Arthur's fingers twitched. Sophia gasped, her eyes widening in disbelief. She had seen it before. Those small, faint movements that had given her hope in the darkest of times, but this time, it was different. This time, the movement was stronger, more deliberate. "Arthur," Sophia whispered, her voice trembling. His eyelids fluttered slightly, as if he were trying to wake up from a long, deep sleep. Sophia's heart raced as she watched him, every fiber of her being willing him to open his eyes. And then, slowly, Arthur's eyes opened. It was just a flicker at first, a brief moment of consciousness, but it was enough to send a wave of joy through Sophia's entire body. Tears filled her eyes as she leaned in closer, gently squeezing his hand. "You're safe now," she whispered, "you're going to be okay." Arthur's eyes fluttered closed again, but Sophia knew that this was only the beginning. The doctors had told her that recovery would be slow, that there were no guarantees, but this moment, this small, miraculous sign of life, was enough to fill her with hope. As Sophia left the hospital that day, a sense of peace settled over her. She had done everything she could for Arthur, and now it was in the hands of fate. But whatever happened next, she knew that she had made a difference. She had fought for him when no one else would, and she had exposed the truth. In the days that followed, Sophia tried to return to her normal life. But things had changed. She had changed. The events of the past few months had left a deep mark on her, but they had also made her stronger. She had discovered a resilience within herself that she never knew existed, and she had learned the power of fighting for what was right, no matter the cost. One evening, as she sat by her window, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Sophia thought back to that first day at the mansion, the fear, the uncertainty. All of it seemed so far away now. She had faced the darkness and come out the other side, and then, almost without thinking, Sophia opened her laptop and began typing. She wasn't sure who would read her words or what impact they would have, but she felt compelled to share her story, Arthur's story, with the world. People needed to know the truth, not just about the Ribeiro family, but about the importance of standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. As her fingers flew across the keyboard, Sophia smiled. It wasn't just a new beginning for Arthur, it was a new beginning for her, too. Conclusion. Sophia's bravery not only saved Arthur from the nightmarish fate his parents had planned for him but also exposed a sinister organization. Now, with Arthur showing signs of recovery, Sophia can finally breathe easy, knowing that she made a difference. Though the road ahead for both of them is uncertain, they've both been given a second chance at life.